The three men drove up the winding roads of northern Arkansas, eager for their Halloween camping trip deep in the hill country. Randy, Kevin, and Mike had been planning this getaway for months, needing a break from their mundane lives in the small town of Oak Ridge. They traveled along bumpy back roads until they found what seemed like the perfect spot, secluded enough to feel adventurous yet still accessible by their SUV. They quickly set up the tent before darkness fell completely, gathering firewood and preparing a hearty meal of grilled steaks and beans as the October chill settled around them. They laughed and drank beer, sharing stories around the campfire. Kevin told about the local legends of the hills, claiming that strange things happened in these parts during Halloween, but Randy and Mike just rolled their eyes, dismissing his tales as typical Halloween nonsense. As the fire died down, they retreated to their tent, settling into their sleeping bags around 11, still buzzing from the beers and good conversation. They drifted off to sleep with the sounds of the forest surrounding them. It was shortly after midnight when Mike jolted awake, hearing something unusual outside the tent. It wasn't the typical forest sounds they'd fallen asleep to, but something different, something unsettling. He nudged Randy and Kevin awake, whispering for them to listen. The sounds were difficult to make out at first, almost like distant chanting or singing, definitely human voices, not animal. The three men exchanged nervous glances as they lay perfectly still, straining to hear more. Kevin's face had gone pale, remembering the stories he'd told earlier about Halloween rituals in these hills. Randy, trying to maintain his composure, suggested they investigate, unable to stand the uncertainty any longer. They quietly slipped on their jackets and boots, stepping out into the moonlit clearing. The cool night air hit their faces as they emerged from the tent, the strange sounds becoming clearer now, definitely voices, rhythmic and organized, coming from somewhere beyond the large hill about 50 yards from their camp. Something about the cadence sent shivers down their spines, but curiosity overwhelmed their apprehension. They moved cautiously toward the hill, using their phone flashlights to navigate the uneven terrain, careful not to make noise. The voices grew louder as they approached the hillside, the chanting more distinct though the words still unclear. The men exchanged nervous glances but continued their ascent, driven by a need to understand what was happening. Reaching the top of the hill, they immediately dropped to their stomachs, crawling the final few feet to peer over the crest. What they saw below made their blood run cold. In a small clearing stood at least 20 figures, men and women dressed in black robes with red symbols adorning them, dancing in a circle around a massive bonfire, the flames reaching 15 feet into the night sky, illuminating the macabre scene. They wore devil horns and masks, their faces painted with intricate symbols as they moved in rhythmic unison, chanting phrases that now became horrifyingly clear: "Hail Satan, Lord of Darkness," and "Sweet Sexy Satan, come to us," over and over. The three friends remained frozen, watching in disbelief as the bizarre ritual unfolded before them. Mike whispered that they should leave immediately, but Randy insisted they stay just a moment longer to try to see who these people were. Kevin noticed with growing horror that some of the faces looked vaguely familiar. The dancing continued for several minutes, then suddenly stopped as if on cue. The circle parted and from within the group emerged a young woman dressed in a flowing white gown, a stark contrast to the black-robed figures surrounding her. Her face seemed serene, almost trance-like, as two robed figures led her to a wooden structure at the center of the clearing. The three men realized with mounting horror that it was an altar, roughly constructed of thick wooden logs bound together with rope. The woman was gently laid upon the altar, her arms and legs spread and secured with what looked like leather straps. The chanting grew more intense, more fervent, as an older man stepped forward from the group, his robe more elaborate than the others, adorned with intricate red symbols. He removed his mask, revealing his face in the firelight, causing Randy to gasp in shock. It was Chief Williams, the Oak Ridge police chief, a man they'd known all their lives, a respected figure in their community who attended church every Sunday and coached Little League baseball. He now stood before this unholy gathering holding aloft a large ceremonial knife, its blade catching the firelight as he began speaking in a language none of them recognized. The chief raised the knife higher above the woman, speaking louder, his voice commanding and powerful. The group responded in unison, their voices rising to a fevered pitch. Suddenly, without warning, he plunged the knife deep into the woman's chest, her body arching upward against the restraints, blood spreading quickly across her white gown. The sight of actual murder unfolding before them was too much for Kevin, who let out an involuntary sob, his hand clasping over his mouth too late to stop the sound from escaping. The chanting stopped abruptly as every head in the clearing turned toward the hillside. One of the robed figures pointed directly at their position, shouting, "Look, they're watching us." 20 pairs of eyes locked onto the hill where the 3 men lay exposed. "My God, we better get out of here quick," Randy hissed, scrambling to his feet, no longer concerned with staying quiet. They abandoned any pretense of stealth and ran, stumbling and sliding down the backside of the hill toward their campsite. Behind them they could hear shouts and the sounds of pursuit crashing through the underbrush. They reached their tent gasping for breath, but didn't stop, running past it straight to their SUV parked on the muddy road. Mike fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking violently as Randy and Kevin kept looking back toward the hill where robed figures were now appearing at the top, silhouetted against the night sky. Mike finally got the door unlocked and they piled in, slamming the doors and locking them immediately. The engine roared to life and Mike threw the vehicle into reverse, spinning the tires in the mud as he turned around to speed down the narrow road they'd come in on. Randy kept looking back through the rear window, his face pale with terror as he reported that the cultists were coming down the hill, running toward them. The SUV lurched forward, gaining speed on the muddy track, the headlights bouncing wildly, illuminating the dense forest on either side. They had gone perhaps half a mile when the vehicle suddenly slowed, the tires spinning without traction. "We're stuck," Mike shouted, slamming his hands against the steering wheel in desperation. The wheels spun helplessly in the thick mud, a result of the heavy rain from the previous night. Kevin and Randy jumped out, attempting to push while Mike kept the engine revving, but the tires only dug deeper into the muck. They pushed with all their strength, muscles straining, sweat pouring down their faces despite the cold night air, but the SUV wouldn't budge. Then Kevin spotted something that made his blood freeze. Looking back up the road, he could see bobbing lights approaching. The cultists were coming with flashlights. "Get back in," he screamed, diving for the door, Randy following close behind. They locked the doors again, breathing heavily. Mike grabbed his phone, frantically dialing 911, his voice cracking as he tried to explain their situation to the dispatcher. "We're somewhere on Old Forest Road past the Johnson Creek Bridge. There are people trying to kill us," he stammered, trying to give more precise directions but realizing with growing horror that he couldn't exactly pinpoint their location. The dispatcher assured him that officers would be dispatched immediately, but Mike knew the police station was at least 20 minutes away, even with sirens blaring. Through the phone they could hear the dispatcher asking more questions, but Mike's attention was drawn to the approaching lights now clearly visible through the trees. The cultists emerged from the darkness, surrounding the vehicle, at least 15 of them still in their ceremonial robes, their faces contorted with rage. Chief Williams was at the front, his robe now stained with blood. He approached the driver's side window, staring directly at Mike with a chilling smile. "You boys should have minded your own business," he said, his voice eerily calm. The 3 men screamed and cursed at the cultists, telling them the police were on their way, but the chief just laughed. "I am the police," he reminded them, as the cultists began rocking the SUV back and forth, trying to tip it over. The vehicle swayed violently as the men clung to whatever they could grab inside. Randy tried calling 911 again, but there was no signal now. The cultists grew more aggressive, some grabbing large rocks from the roadside and smashing them against the windows. Cracks began to appear in the glass, spider webbing across the surface. Kevin sobbed openly now while Mike continued to gun the engine, hoping for a miracle that wouldn't come. With a final heave, the cultists managed to push the SUV onto its side, the men inside thrown against the doors and windows. A rock smashed through the rear window, showering them with glass. One of the cultists reached through the broken window, unlocking the door from inside and pulling it open. The 3 men screamed and fought desperately, clawing and punching at their attackers, but they were quickly overwhelmed, dragged from the vehicle and held down on the muddy ground. Chief Williams stood over them, his knife still wet with blood from the earlier sacrifice. "You've witnessed our sacred rite, and now you must join us, one way or another," he proclaimed as the cultists began chanting again, dragging the struggling men back toward their ritual site, their screams echoing through the empty forest, drowned out by the enthusiastic chanting of their captors, their fate sealed by their innocent curiosity and unfortunate timing. When the state police arrived nearly 40 minutes later, responding to the interrupted 911 call, they found the SUV on its side, windows smashed, doors hanging open, but no sign of the three men. Despite an extensive search throughout the night and following days involving multiple agencies and tracking dogs, no trace of Randy, Kevin, or Mike was ever found. Their tent still stood at the campsite, their belongings untouched, their cooler still full of beer. The only evidence of violence was the damaged SUV and some footprints in the mud that disappeared into the forest. Chief Williams led the investigation himself, appearing appropriately concerned and professional, organizing search parties and press conferences, asking for information, but the case gradually went cold, becoming just another unsolved mystery in the hills of northern Arkansas. Back in Oak Ridge, rumors persisted. Some claimed the men had encountered a bear or gotten lost in the wilderness. Others whispered about strange cults and Halloween sacrifices, but no one dared voice these theories too loudly, especially not around Chief Williams, who continued to serve the community with distinction, attending church every Sunday, coaching Little League, and organizing the annual Halloween festival with its traditional bonfire that lit up the autumn night, attracting participants from all the surrounding towns, its flames reaching high into the darkness, illuminating faces both familiar and strange as they danced around it, celebrating in ways that most of the townspeople would never fully understand.